Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the Art Business Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Federica Carlotto. And I know Federica, she's a colleague of mine at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London, where she is now program director of an exciting new master's program in luxury business. And prior to that, Federica was teaching a semester course in the same subject, which proved so popular with the students that we decided in the end, or the Institute decided to turn it into a master's degree, which is now, I think, in its second iteration, Federica. Anyway, welcome, Federica.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me here. Yes, it's the second iteration. Yes.
Yeah, second edition of this year for the new MA in luxury business. I do a lecture at the start of the program, for example, on the development of ideas on luxury in the ancient Greek and Roman world, and the students are great, and they're receptive to the historical aspects and so on. We'll be talking more about the content and mission of that program later in the podcast. But as usual, Federica, I'm going to start by asking you what your favorite city is and why.
It might be very obvious. I think I have to reply with Verona, my hometown city.
Verona? No, it's not obvious. Most people say London for some reason, so it's great to have Verona.
But I think it's more because of the relationship that has been evolving in years. When you grow up in a town, in a city, you take it for granted somehow. And then my life took me abroad, took me 5 years in Japan for my MA and PhD. And then now I've been living in London for 10 years. And so over the years, every time I go back, the relationship somehow changes. And I remember when I was in Japan, somebody asked me, what do you miss most of Italy? And I said, the stones of Verona, because of course in Japan, the traditional architecture is wooden architecture or concrete, skyscrapers. And so after 5 years, I really miss that kind of marble, the pink marble and Absolutely. The stones of the Roman part of the city. And most recently, with the lockdown, when we were allowed, I was back to Italy for a few months, and we were allowed just to move. We didn't have a lot of movement, let's say, within the region. And so the only highlight of the week was to go to the city center. And again, it's incredible how much you can discover and rediscover of a city that you have been living there for most part of your life.
Absolutely, and I guess that's because your own experiences change, and you visit with new eyes. Federica, what I love Verona. I think the first time I went to Verona, I was actually leading. This was long before I was at the Institute. I was leading cultural tours for a British company, and these included the opera. And so there was a cultural tour where it was amazing. We stayed in Verona for 5 days, and included were tickets to the famous opera in the ancient Roman amphitheatre, which of course suits my interest, in Verona. And I suspect some of the listeners might have experienced that. But would you maybe you could just say a little bit about what else there is in Verona for people to visit, other than the opera at the wonderful amphitheatre?
I guess something that I came to appreciate, and actually when I have guests myself, I do little tours as well, right? When you have guests, I think the churches, the historical churches, there is a tour that you can do. I think it is 5 or 6 churches, and each church has a specific history, a specific architecture. And it's incredible. From the Duomo, then you have a few, there is exactly a tour. And I think even if you're not interested in the religious dimension of that, it's just to see the amount of work, craftsmanship that went into those buildings that is just astonishing, and the differences and how history speaks through the different layers as well of these buildings. So I think it's this is something that maybe as I said, you know, it's interesting that you were lucky to stay 5 days, because usually the tours go, you know, maybe you go to Venice and then before going to Milan, or vice versa, you stop quickly in Verona and then you maybe do half a day, which I think it's a shame, because besides the amphitheater, there is a whole, you know, even Castelvecchio, which is the castle that we have in the city center, and the Roman architecture, the gates of the cities as well. It just speaks history quite a big deal. And so, yes, I would recommend to stop at least more than half a day.
Yeah, I remember we stopped once with our MA Art business students when we were traveling between Venice and Torino. We go to Artissimo in the Contemporary Art Fair in Torino. Haven't done that since lockdown, but we're planning to do that, go back to that from next year. It's in early November. But we also go to Venice, and we used to take the coach. We now get the train. When we took the coach, there was one occasion when we stopped at Verona for a break on the way for lunch and so on. Even in a couple of hours, we divided the students into smaller groups and did a little tour each with them before lunch. And yeah, I went. I think there's a Roman bridge, isn't there? There is an ancient Roman bridge.
Yes.
Yeah, I took the students to that, and it's very beautiful down by the river there. And then the church, the church art I particularly remember, is it San Zeno?
Yes.
Which has a Bellini, a Giovanni Bellini altarpiece.
Mantegna. I think
Mantegna, that's it. It's Mantegna. It's a long time ago. It's a Mantegna, that's right. So there's fantastic sort of painting in those churches as well, I seem to remember.
And also in that church, there is a wooden statue of the Bishop of Verona, San Zeno. That's right. And it's quite an interesting statue because the bishop, and it's a saint, of course, he's smiling.
Yes.
And so it's quite peculiar considering the times. He's smiling. And so there is a whole legend there. There is a way of saying that people from Verona are crazy, and this refers to because maybe they love drinking, and then somebody else says because of the statue. So this is also quite interesting.
And of course, there's another famous statue in Verona of Juliet from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which is I seem to remember that's a great tourist pull, particularly for younger tourists and Italians. Do you want to just say a little bit about the House of Romeo? I think it is. House of Juliet, is it?
Yes. No, to be honest, I have to be honest, and I hope I don't spoil. It's just an insider talk, let's say, but well, of course, it's a touristic attraction, right? So it's not as historically accurate. Yeah, I think that what makes it special, I think, is the feelings of people. Let's say it like that. It's not of historical interest, but what is important is that when people want to celebrate love, of course, or you want to gain love, because that statue. If you touch, I don't remember which breast, but if you touch one of the breasts of Juliet, then you will get lucky. So there is still hope.
So there's almost like a kind of like in Roman Catholic churches, particularly in Italy, you get similar things with religious statues, particularly of the Madonna, where people feel that they're going to be healed by her and then leave these little silver objects to say thank you for healing me. It's fantastically moving, and it's quite interesting. It's almost like a secular pagan version of that, isn't it? Touching Juliet's breasts, taking a selfie against it, hoping for a loved one, or being with a loved one. And I seem to remember there's all sorts of graffiti on the brick walls of the courtyard there where lovers, a bit like the kind of padlocks that people put on the Pont Neuf in Paris.
Yes, I agree with that. I think it's the right way of seeing it. Yeah.
The historical background is dubious. So, and talking about the churches, would one of those churches be? If I had to say, what's your favorite building in the world? Would it be one of those churches, or would it be somewhere else?
I have to say, Palazzo Te Palace in Mantova.
Yes, the Giulio Romano Mannerist Palace, fantastic.
It's I don't know what is that in the building, in the palace. Yeah, I've been a few times just because, and this tells me that there is the proportions, the cleanness, you just see architecture 100%. You're not distracted. There are frescoes, of course, magnificent frescoes, but I think it's the proportion, the space. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, Renaissance and the idea of human beings being at the center in a way of the universe, and how we can inhabit that universe, I think that the architecture there really it speaks to me in that way. You feel right in that space. And then while you progress in the rooms, you know, it's just a journey into proportions, into, I would say, well-being. I always thought, you know, if I ever had a big house, that would be the that would be the model.
So for the listeners, that's the Palazzo Te, Te, which is on the outskirts. So I think it was almost a villa at the time, almost like a countryside villa at the time, on the outskirts of the wonderful Gonzaga city of Mantua.
Yes.
So I think typically you would visit the Palazzo Ducale, the Ducal Palace within the city, and then you can travel out. It's walkable, I seem to remember, about a 45-minute walk out to this wonderful Palazzo Te. The architect Giulio Romano, it's a great Mannerist masterpiece, so it's still using classical architecture, but it's doing very interesting things with it at the same time. So as you say, Federica, it has a sense of calm and order, but it also has a bit more than that, because he's doing some strange anti-classical things at the same time, as with the frescoes on the interior.
I remember the grotto there, I think.
Yes.
There is, yeah. And also, I don't know, David, because of course you are interested in the Roman architecture as well, right? Does it make you feel like you are in a sort of Roman villa?
Definitely, and that was the idea, I guess, to give a kind of frescoed effect, like from the discovered Nero's Golden Palace in Rome that was found in the late 15th century, and they see these frescoes, and I think that leads to artists frescoing their buildings. And we talked about the Palazzo Te being a bit more of a villa in the countryside setting. So do you have a favorite countryside location, Federica, that you particularly love to go to get away from the city sometimes?
Can I go back to Japan at this point? Can we travel a little bit?
Yeah.
Of course, I don't have many chances to go to Japan whenever I want to escape London, but definitely the countryside in Japan during the autumn.
Oh, wow.
Now we are in autumn, just to see the leaves changing colors. I think Nikko is just an amazing place. It's stuck in the mountains, and it's the site where the first shogun, so the head of the military government in Japan, so we are 17th century, he established his shrine there. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful environment. Again, if we talk about the spirit of a place, of course, you have this historical monument, but more than that, I think is the nature speaking there. And then in autumn,
the other thing in Japan, I've never been to Japan. I'd love to go, but we've had Japanese students in the past, and they've always said, "Oh, look at the photos! You must come, David, and visit us." And the famous ones as well are, of course, the cherry blossom in the spring with Mount Fuji with still snow covered in the background, and we see that in like Hokusai paintings and so on. And what about music? Do you listen to music, or aren't you really into music, or do you have any kind of favorite music?
You know, for me, music is always in the background, so it depends on the moment. I have to say. So if I want to focus classic music, I got into the Goldberg variation, but just because a friend recommended to me.
Yes.
Otherwise, you know, I think that a genre that speaks to me is actually new jazz, so kind of electronic jazz. So Pair of Stellar is one, and you know, they used to come to London quite often. I would say at least once a year, so I would go and listen to their music. So it's an Austrian musician, but then he works in an ensemble with others.
So kind of more experimental jazz rather than trad jazz, as it were.
Yeah, but then there is an element of nostalgia, of retro. but then with with also some kind of contamination from other genres. So
Contamination, I love it. And the Goldberg Variations, of course, by Johann Sebastian Bach, one of his great masterpieces. I think for the harpsichord originally.
I wouldn't say.
I mean, I think it was a keyboard, and then it became for piano, and then sometimes they orchestrate it. I can't remember, but yeah, there you go. And then art, coming now more into your interest in what you're doing at the Institute now with luxury. Can you remember? Do you have any early memories of art from your childhood, or can you remember when you first started getting interested in things that weren't necessary to our lives, but things that were maybe unnecessary, such as art, some would argue, and that might lead us on in a moment to think about defining luxury. But just do you have any favorite artists, I guess, is the question.
Favorite artist?
Or have you any early memories of art growing up in Verona?
I have to say, if I go back to my memories, that was through my family. So my parents used to have a camping car, a caravan car. I don't know how you call it. It's a camping car.
Yeah.
And since I was 1 year old, basically we would travel. We would travel a lot, and it was really kind of hardcore traveling, because at the time my parents would buy those guides. We didn't have mobile phones back then, so it was guides, and the guides for the Italian listeners is the guides of the Touring Club.
Yeah.
And those guides are, maybe you know it as well.
Yeah, no, I used to get them when I was doing these cultural tours. They're fantastic. These kind of green covered or blue covered things, like little thin books to the different regions of Italy. And they're a bit like our blue guides or Baedekers.
Okay, so I remember, if you compare them to the Lonely Planet guides, I mean, there is no comparison. And so I remember with my parents reading loud, especially they were very detailed, right, in the description of the artistic monuments. And so when I was a kid, I had to listen to this very, my parents reading this very long description of the church, every single column, every single, work of art. So that was the kind of approach I got. And then I have to say that came naturally, because by living in Verona, then we would get, at the time, the local bank was actually giving all the students in Verona a sort of diary book with all the monuments and an explanation of the monuments. So it was pretty much ingrained in our way of living. And so that kept on. I remember at a certain point when I was in high school, Impressionists becoming very, very hot, as an attraction to museums. I remember one exhibition of Monet in Milan, and I remember I cut school. I don't know how you say it, but I cut school in order to go to Milan. I told my parents, I'm not going to go to school, but I'm going to Milan to see Monet.
Yes. We have lots of slang words for that, such as bunked off, skived off. There's lots of words that school kids use for not attending classes. But to go to an artist, I think we forgive you if you're going to a Monet exhibition.
I was forgiven by my parents, so that was okay.
Well, that's an interesting first experience, and obviously growing up in, I think you're the first Italian guest on the podcast, and I kind of, whenever I speak to my Italian students, they grow up with art, and and some that can sometimes be almost too much of a burden. They always having to know about ancient Greek and Roman and Renaissance art. A lot of the students then come across London and say, thank God for that, I can be in the contemporary art world. But generally I find that they have a real love for the Italian artistic tradition, and that it's a specifically Italian thing.
Well, even you mentioned before the amphitheater. When I was back last time, I went to, we have also a Roman theater, which is very close to the river.
Yeah, I remember.
And I went to see a modern rendition of the Iliad.
Wow.
And I was impressed. I was looking at the other people in the audience. I was impressed by how much still everybody really, you could see there was some, professor rather than intellectual, but then you would see people like us attending, and young people. So you really feel that is something that we all share, and I'm sure you appreciate that. The classics actually speak so much of our world today. So I was thinking, watching this the Iliad, how much this speaks to us still nowadays in the times we live. So I understand it might be overwhelming at a certain point, so you need to get away from it. But every time I go back to it, I find sense in a way, or more sense into the appreciation of art, for instance, and the past. Is a nice way to reflect about the world. So I don't have a favorite artist, but I do like to, and I do enjoy to understand, and I ask myself, what do they want to say? How do they see the world? That's the meaning for me.
I think that's a very good piece of advice for our students. Just give, we're so busy with our quick fits, like images all the time, that I think it's good sometimes to learn to go into a gallery and just pick maybe one room or one painting or two and sit and just really, really look at it and get absorbed by it. Because after all, the artist has put all that time in. So why shouldn't we put time back into it? And, talking about music, how long does it take to listen to the Goldberg variations in its entirety? Probably over an hour. And yet we won't sit in front of a Picasso and look for an hour usually. So, it's a skill that we've kind of lost, I think, because of the swift moving of images today. So,
I felt the same when I went to Castelvecchio, which is the medieval castle in Verona. They have an amazing collection of paintings, which were actually stolen, and then somehow they got back to the city. And when I was back to see those paintings, I realized how much ignorant we are as contemporary human beings with all this symbology. Of course, paintings like the subjects were religious subjects, but how much these paintings would like to speak and how ignorant we are in not being able to detect what they really want to say, and all the symbology and the iconography. And I was, and also how much we should provide visitors with the means, with tools, even kind of fancy tools or interesting tools, using also Instagram to educate people to read those and to enable this communication between human beings and the piece, the work of art.
Absolutely. And I remember taking students, like when we visit Torino, as you know, it's got an amazing art collection, that because the Savoy family was there in the Renaissance, and very wealthy art collectors, like all Italian dynasties, and Franco-Italian, obviously, in the case of Savoy's. But they've got this magnificent art collection. But when I've taken students around there, I have to spend a lot of time just reminding them of the biblical story or the Greek mythological story. You mentioned the theatrical performance of the Homer's Iliad, one of the first pieces of Western literature from the 8th century BCE. So, increasingly 100 years ago, or maybe a bit longer now, probably before World War One, most educated people knew their Greek and Latin and their and their Bible. They went to church, and of course, increasingly, that has just disappeared from our educational system and from our cultural systems. And it's a problem, of course, that in our MA and art business, it's an issue for people wanting to go into what we call the old masters sector, because there is an issue there in trying to get younger people interested in old masters because of those biblical and mythological narratives that they just often don't understand, and B, other cultures, trying to get, say, Chinese buyers interested in Western old masters because they don't understand a lot of the time those stories as well. So it is a kind of issue, but we treat it positively. And the reason those stories survived in the first place because they're good stories. So usually the storytelling becomes part of the process of enjoying the work, but also selling it. If a dealer tells you the story behind the work, you're immediately grabbing the interest of the potential buyer. Anyway, Federica, I guess we better come to the kind of core of this discussion. But it's been really, really interesting having that initial talk. So where did your interest in this concept of luxury come from? How did that begin out of what you've just told us about your interest in music and art and so on?
You know, I was thinking about it, and I think it comes, well, my interest in luxury actually started from an interest in fashion. And that came from my mother, because my mother used to make my clothes and her clothes.
Wow.
So in a way,
With a sewing machine.
Yes. It was a hobby for her.
Yes.
Also, we didn't have much money, you know, to renovate our wardrobe, renew our wardrobe every season. And so somehow I was immersed in this world where I would get really original clothes all the time, very different from everybody else. At times, I remember dearly, she was dressing, and my mother would dress myself and herself as a mini me, you know, the mini me when you dress coordinated.
Yes.
So the same color and slightly different cut, but still quite similar. And so I was always immersed in this idea where you would have colors, different colors and different kind of design on your body. And so I always had this eye for dresses and how people appear and how they express themselves through what they wear. And then with luxury, the term luxury, and that is a story that my mom usually tells me, so it's a reported story. My mom told me that we went to visit Portugal once, and we had to take a cab, and I don't even remember myself, so maybe I was 4 or 5, and I think I told my mom something like, well, next time can we have a more luxurious cab? And my mom was like, I don't know where that came from. And so somehow the attention to things that are somehow on the upper tier, the attention towards detail, this kind of aesthetics, somehow, I think these are the two elements I can somehow put together to justify that. And then, you know, when I had to choose, I won a scholarship to go to Japan. And when I had to choose my area, at that point, I said, you know, I'm going to go for fashion sociology, because that's pretty much my interest. And, you know, while dealing with topics and writing my dissertations, I would naturally pick luxury brands as an example within fashion. And then once I finished there, I started the academic career. At a certain point, I really wanted to go into the business side of things. And so I took a sabbatical. I enrolled in an MBA. And the specialization at the beginning for this MBA was a fashion business or something. So I said, okay, I'm going to go for that. And in the moment of enrolling, they told me, actually, instead of maybe fashion business, is going to be a specialization in luxury brand management. I'm like, yeah, fine. And this is how I got.
Sorry, did you say luxury brand management?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, that was the specialization. And so from fashion, I transitioned into luxury, really.
Yeah. How interesting. So it begins really with your with coming out of necessity, really. That's what's quite interesting, that out of necessity, which is often seen as the opposite of luxury, the things that we really need to exist in the world. And you needed clothes, and your mum made them because of relative poverty. But though, in a sense, those clothes, paradoxically, I bet your friends sometimes kind of like envied you some of these things because you couldn't buy them in the shops. Is that possible?
Yes.
Or were they really functional looking? And you know, I suspect that they were actually really, really nice and very individual, which of course in itself then paradoxically becomes a luxury object because it's unique, like a work of art.
Yes, exactly. And I can tell you that if I go back to my childhood, I can say I had a very luxurious life back then, not only because of the dresses, but also because I was mentioning before that my parents had a camping car.
Yes.
These were the late 70s, early 80s, which meant that you wouldn't have the amount of caravans now traveling around.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, that was a sort of artisanal camping car. It was actually a truck transporting salt, another luxury item in the past. And
Yes.
my dad readjusted as a camping car. And that was a very cheap way of traveling in a moment where hotels were expensive and everybody would go on holidays in hotels. What happened is that we would be on the road. And so the adventures and the exclusive actually experiences that we got is something that you wouldn't be able to replicate today. We went to Petra.
Petra
and
in,
nowadays
in Lebanon.
Petra isn't.
It's Jordan, isn't it?
Jordan.
Is it
Syria.
Jordan or Syria?
Oh.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
apologies, but it's the ancient city of Petra.
Yes, and nowadays you have to book, you have guided tours, it's quite crowded.
Camels sometimes.
Exactly. But the magic of going there just on your own and having the privilege to meet with the guide, telling you about his life. We were really adventurous. And if I go back, now there is a lot of status in say, I'm traveling here and there.
Yes.
And for me, the luxury is that I visited those countries when it was very exclusive to do so. And I have my memories. And these are really, really luxury for me in a way.
It's a great story. It's a great story, Federica, because out of necessity, you actually ended up doing very special, unique things that maybe your wealthier friends weren't doing. The same thing happened to me. My friends were all traveling on jets to the Caribbean, down to the Spanish islands, etc., etc. And because my father worked for what was then the nationalized British Railways, the whole family would get free tickets anywhere in Europe. and so when we went to Italy and Spain, we went by train. And I remember thinking it was so romantic. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, I'd look out the window and I'd smell the local donuts being made, and they'd sell them through the window. I'd give them money. Mm-hmm. And then in the morning, my father would take us all down to the buffet car, which used to be more like an Orient spread, like a luxury buffet mm-hmm. car, very different to the ones today. And we'd sit there with the tablecloth, eating croissants and coffee, watching the Alps go by as we came across into Italy. So, and I was kind of envious of that. My friends used to take the mickey. You can't afford to go by plane. And now when I think, of course, now rail travel is the luxury and flying is like EasyJet and the necessity. So again, it's quite interesting, that paradox in doing things that aren't luxury, but that are in a sense.
Yes, I agree with you. And I guess that this is pretty much the gateway to understand luxury as well. It's a very dynamic concept. And, I so understand what you say, because my dad used to work for the National Italian Railways as well.
Before they were all divided up and privatized, yeah.
And so, in a way, I understand the kind of slow traveling and the idea of experience that nowadays, we talk a lot about experiential economy and people looking for experience. But I always say, you also have the right mindset to appreciate that.
Yes.
And to somehow savor those experiences and making it part of who you are. Because this is the luxury nowadays, right? It's about being able to appreciate things as well, I would say. Mm-hmm. In a world that has become very noisy. Think about the travel, just because we're talking about traveling, think about, how many people travel, and traveling has become, even by plane, as you said, it has become actually quite distracting somehow, right?
Yeah, and of course unsustainable in terms of the planet. We're about to have the COP conference. You can probably hear I'm under a flight path into Heathrow. And so every 90 seconds a plane is coming over my head. Hopefully it's not disturbing the recording too much. We all probably...
No, I cannot hear it, so it's fine.
Oh, that's good. Within the microphone I'm using is omnidirect. I can make it omnidirectional, so it's only hearing me. And we're increasingly, when we do our study trips in the institute, we if possible, we're now taking the train rather than a coach or an aeroplane. So we're trying to do our bit for sustainability. Obviously, when we go to Venice, it's impossible. We have to take the plane.
Of
But as
course.
much as possible, we're kind of trying to be a bit more sustainable. But so coming on to the program at the institute, probably presumably, how did that happen? Was the institute reaching out and looking for someone who could teach a luxury semester course, or did you suggest it, or how did that happen in the first place?
I think the institute had an idea. They had the idea. I think it was coming from the fact that big auction houses started opening departments specializing in luxury, the trade of luxury goods. And so luxury somehow entered in the radar. And this is how it started. So for me, I was coming from another institution. I was teaching luxury brand management there. Yes. So for me, it was a very interesting environment. It was a new environment because I was teaching in a business and management department, and here I come to a very humanistic environment, and where I had actually to consider also the relationship between art and luxury naturally. So it was very interesting to me as a discovery of that world that I had been in touch, as we said before, in a very amateur way. And so trying to look at luxury also from the artistic perspective, also within a different framework, let's say. And then, of course, I was coming with all my thinking about luxury being its own discipline. And somehow it came mutually between, of course, the institute and myself. I kept saying, look, luxury is its own discipline, and it has its own academic validity. And this is how actually we started talking to develop a master program that would specialize in the luxury industry, with, of course, an edge or with a side kind of unit, let's say, dealing with the relationship between art and luxury.
Yeah, and as you say, that the current owner or main owner of Sotheby's, Drahi, I know when he came in that he said that my vision is to turn Sotheby's, for example, from being a fine art auctioneer into a luxury business where fine art becomes one of several luxuries that, like, including like usually secondhand Gucci handbags, etc. All of those things that they'd already been selling. But he wanted to, as far as I know, he wanted to kind of highlight those departments. I'm not. I think at first everyone thought that this was going to really take over, but I'm not. It doesn't look that different to me over the last couple of years. Sotheby's, it still looks not dissimilar to what it used to look like. But as you say, it's very interesting, this concept of is fine art a luxury good, or you said earlier that luxury is its own academic discipline and it can stand alone without necessarily having to have art within its frame. But maybe you could say something about how, when you're creating the master's degree and it's validated by the University of Manchester, so it has to be kind of academically tight, what are the core modules and what was your academic thinking behind those units, as we call them at the institute?
I think first of all, as I said, I took into account the environment I was. And so the humanistic aspect that really resonated with myself, but also with what I personally believe also academically. And that is the fact that when we talk about business, we usually tend to think about, of course, revenue, about markets. And we use these words that somehow they don't take into account that at the end of the day, businesses are made by people for people. And so the value, what we call value in business terms, is not something that is determined by the price. You could say, yes, demand and offer, but what is demand? With luxury, demand is desire. And desire, it's a very, very, if you want, emotional term. It's not how do you quantify desire? Yes, you can quantify, we know we can, but it's something that moves you. And this is something that I think can be applicable to a luxury item as well as to a painting.
Mm-hmm.
You work with people feelings here. You work with also people aspiration. You work with people's ambition, to belong to a certain circle, to show off certain, cultural understanding, for instance, of art, or connoisseurship of a certain brand. So it's a very, I think both art and luxury actually are very, very human and humanistic businesses. And so my idea was really to start with a question that was, what is luxury first? And you mentioned, of course, you are coming as a guest speaker, one of the very first guest speakers I usually invite, because we need to start to ask ourselves, what is luxury for me? And then asking, what is luxury for the person close to me? And then widen our horizon and saying, what is luxury for my society, the society I have around? Because then when we talk about marketing business, we know that these markets are made by people. And we are able then to produce a value that is really resonant with those people, because we know to read them. So then, of course, the course is luxury business. So we talk about all the infrastructure, we talk about markets, consumer behavior, marketing, and branding. But if there is not this approach, my idea or my feeling is that then we become very reactive to the market. And in business, when you become reactive, you lose.
Yes.
You need to anticipate, or at least you need to be at pace with what is happening in the market, in the minds of the people. If I can give you an example, right now luxury brands are going with pet wear and kind of accessory for pets. Now, this comes because, of course, during the pandemic, we know people have been basically buying pets and having pets in their homes for company. And also, people have developed a relationship with pets. We know how much related we are with our pets. There was a discussion between cats and dogs, but let's say that especially with dogs have become an extension of ourselves. For younger people who are delaying, for instance, the idea of family and having kids, dogs are an extension of ourselves. We can spoil them. And this is where luxury brand realized there was an opportunity there. Again, it's not about the dogs, it's about our relationship with our pets. I say dogs because, of course, cats are more independent, and then there is a social element in that as well. You don't take your cat, for a walk. You take your dog, and then maybe you take your dog on a purse, and you go, to have coffee with your friends with your dog. There is a social element there, and this is where luxury brands are working on. So this is somehow the connection between society, but also our feelings that we have towards our pets and the business opportunities.
So just to illustrate to the viewers, if I can do this, I'm working from home today, and that is my pet, bought just before the first lockdown. That was coincidentally, I'd had a border collie, a sheepdog before. She's beautiful. Her name's Drift. She's now 2.5. But what she's lying in is a luxury basket. The best of the best for our dog. So it's made of. It's like maybe we could come on to talk about this. This is kind of local British. This is kind of like English luxury almost. Sheep's wool from Yorkshire. Where the sheep where the sheep are in England, it was a Christmas present to her, pretty expensive, and she, as you can see, she loves it. But she's also got a Barbour raincoat with a label on, you can tell it's Barbour. And Barbour, for the listeners, if you don't know, is a kind of luxury brand. I believe the Chinese are really into Barbour, for example, as a kind of British brand, luxury brand. So I don't know, would you call Barbour a luxury brand, Federica? Maybe not.
I would say it has been, and it could be. For instance, Barbour was, when I was in high school, it was a luxury brand, because in my high school, that was really trendy. It had a very high, high price point, especially for young kids, as we were. And
Yeah.
so what it used to be definitely a luxury back then in my environment, because then what happened is quite funny, the mechanism. What happened is that when the following season came up, there was another, I think, I'm not sure it's a British brand, it's Woolrich. It's another brand. And then these people would change your wardrobe from Barbour to Woolrich. What happened is that those people who actually were able to buy Barbour, saving up money, or maybe their parents told them, look, we're going to buy you the Barbour, but then the Barbour jacket, but then that's it.
Yes.
And they had to stay with Barbour.
Yes.
And so you could see the difference in between those people who actually could afford to change their wardrobe seasonally and people who couldn't. So again, another idea of the dynamism between, luxury, fashion, and trends, and how much do they speak to us about us, really?
Yeah, in some ways, Barbour is a kind of luxury brand because it tends to be quite expensive, and the shops tend to be in the kind of luxury areas of, say, London and so on. But it's a very English, it's very British thing. It's very practical, and it lasts. And you wear it out when you're walking the dog in the rain and it's from the countryside, but we brought it into the city, which is an interesting. It's a bit like driving a Range Rover that was basically designed for farmers. You don't need a 4-wheel drive in Chelsea, and then it becomes a luxury fashion because they're very expensive to have. So
Yes, I guess Barbour. I think Barbour was able to take the practicality, the waterproof element,
yes,
I think, and then make it, of course, what it is, fashionable and then luxury, I guess.
Yes, yes. I remember when I used to be studying in Italy, doing my research down in the Bay of Naples, and I was there in winter and when no tourists around. I used to get the train to Pompeii from Sorrento, the Chicken Vesuviana, and the kids would be the teenagers would be going to school, and I noticed then that there was definitely brands that they had to have a certain kind of backpack. I just trying to remember what it was at the time, but that it was a bit like Nike's today, that everybody had to have the same brand, and if you didn't, you were probably considered poor or whatever. I guess those objects weren't necessarily expensive, but it's another kind of brand that is aimed at like a lower economic level, if you like. But do you think something similar is going on there, where teenagers all want to wear the right thing, even though it's not particularly expensive?
No, and this is why, in a way, when we talk about luxury, of course, there might be objective definitions of what a luxury object is. But I'm really interested, and this is why somehow I tend to go also beyond luxury, because we said before, it's about also desire. So, for instance, the teenagers at school, this is a market, this is they have their own society. And what is trendy in that society then becomes desirable, right? Yeah. And so that maybe is more fashion than anything else, but it's, on the other hand, it also established some sort of hierarchy. And so within that small society, having certain things qualifies you as hierarchically, let's say, on the very top. So this is why sometimes, I have some, some people or other academics telling me, yes, but we, if we were not to have our society where there is an inequality, let's say primitive villages, okay, let's go back to that, luxury wouldn't exist. And I always counter argue that actually it would, because I said, let's go to the Amazonian forest. You can identify specifically who the head of the village is. Maybe he can just use certain flowers to decorate his body. Maybe he can use certain beads for his necklace, and all the others are prohibited from having those. Or maybe there is an economy that justify the possession of those elements. So again, it's not maybe about luxury, but status certainly. Even if you had a very, very simple society, you would always have this kind of way for people to distinguish themselves. And, you know, in human beings, there is always this desire to be different because we are all different. On the other hand, there is always the desire to fit in. And so this is the mechanism that rule, of course, fashion. And then in luxury, of course, then you play on a higher level, but that's the same mechanism, basically. And so, you know, even when we have, you know, a situation like school kids, there is exactly the same mechanism. And you know, we know well now that the age of luxury consumers, you know, has been actually, you know, going towards younger generation. We were talking about, you know, generation of, you know, collectors or consumers is going younger. So because also they can count on the wallets of their parents and grandparents and so on. So
what sort of an academic what is the kind of academic bibliography for luxury as an emerging academic? Would you say it's an emerging academic discipline? We might say so, like as is art business. You know, what we mean by that is that it hasn't been considered a worthy object to study until relatively recently, and in many ways I think the institute is kind of almost leads the world in this. You know, it was the first arguably it was the first sort of like serious master's degree where we're focusing on art business rather than just art, if you like, and it's a problem for us because there is now, there's more, but there wasn't that much in terms of peer-reviewed academic studies that we could use for our students. Is that what are the recent developments in what do academics who study luxury, what are they particularly interested in? Is there a trend over the last, say, 5 to 10 years that they tend to focus on certain aspects of luxury academics?
You're right in saying that luxury is emergent, because I find myself sometimes when you prepare classes, you have to kind of pick and choose. So for instance, in my case, I pick from history. So history books or books talking about consumer behavior in the past, for instance, when we talk about the history of luxury. There are specific books that have become a little bit, I call them the Bibles, in the sense that they are somehow very specific to luxury. The Idea of Luxury, written by Christopher Berry, and that was 1995, if I'm not mistaken. And that takes a sort of philosophical approach to the concept of luxury. Then you consider luxury, you know, as I said, in context. So you might read about tulips in the Netherlands and the trade of tulips, and you realize that actually they were luxury, or the salt trade in the past, the Silk Road. So you have to distill from that, and that is for the historical part. In terms of business, you know, luxury stems a little bit from the studies around fashion, because then you take, of course, the top tier of fashion brands. We have a study from Kafferer, which is the luxury strategy. But then there have been a lot written on branding, marketing. Most recently, as you can imagine, I think it might be applicable to art, perhaps, a lot on sustainability. Sustainability has become, you know, again, a very, very important topic for luxury. And so I see it also in the interest of the students when they write or what they are interested in, definitely sustainability. And so it's kind of a discipline that it's evolving with, I would say, more and more articles or publications written specifically on luxury and saying, we are going to look into that, rather than episodically saying, oh, this is a study on Prada. You know, it has become more and more, you know, a box, an academic or a intellectual box where you can say, yes, I'm writing and I'm in the luxury studies field.
That's the kind of academic side of what you're doing with your students. On the more practical, professional practice side, maybe you could say something, for example, about the study visits that you do, both in London, maybe do you go outside of London, but also some of the kind of foreign visits you do. You know, what is the rationale for those visits in terms of the students then learning from people working in luxury?
Yes, of course, luxury is a field that changes every single day.
Yeah.
And so I think that there needs to be a balance between, in a way, the theory or the reflection. As you well know, whenever we academics write, it gets published maybe 2 or 3 years down the line. So, our is more of a reflection that is very important, though. It's very important to lay the foundation for a long-term understanding of what's going on. At the same time, it's a very fast-paced, it's a very disruptive industry at the moment. And so we need to ensure that we bring the students very, very close, or even behind the scene, as we like to say it at the Institute, of what is happening in the industry. And so the visits that we organize, we do 2 field trips. One is in Paris, the other one is in Italy. And the rationale behind those is actually to make the students aware that luxury is not set, and each country somehow, each place, have their own way of interpreting luxury, have their own way of producing luxury. For instance, when we went to Paris, there was a stress of every single speaker. And of course, we speak with many people in many positions, in many sectors of the luxury industry. The key word that I really took with me was the savoir-faire, the know-how, the training, the relevance on the training and the length of the training that people working in the industry have. With Italy, we go to Italy, and there is a different kind of vibe. And the vibe is that of, it's more informal, if you want, although we are still speaking of the industry, but luxury industry, but it's more creativity. It's more, let's see what we can do with what we have in terms of excellence. So there is a little bit of an adventure there. And so I remember, some students telling me, wow, it's so great to see this kind of variety of interpretation. And the principle there is that, as you know, David, we get students from all over the world. So we might have students from Asia, from China, from Latin America, from Africa. And so my wish for them is that they can say, well, this is luxury as interpreted in a sort of European environment. Let's try and find our own kind of luxury, our own identity within the luxury industry. That is the scope. And of course, London is another hub for luxury. And so, just going, just visiting and entering the store. And what I like is having people telling the stories. This is very important. My question usually, when there is the chance, I always ask them, how did you start it? Because it's important for the student to see the bridge between themselves as learners, but also as future professionals, and what could be.
Yeah,
so it's a very important part of our program. Yes.
Yeah, and presumably the areas of London you would be focusing on, would they tend to be Mayfair, St James, the kind of obvious ones, or are there? Maybe you could say something about, you were talking about Italians being more creative and there being a vibe of let's see what we can do. Is there such a thing as emerging luxury markets, new disruptive brands or appearing on the scene? And how do they get in on something that is so associated with tradition? How would a new handbag designer, for example, a new kid on the block, as it were, of luxury goods, how would they challenge the traditional Gucci's and Vuittons of the world? Have you got an example of that?
Okay, for instance, one independent brand that has come up, and it's not from an emerging market though, is Jacquemus with his bags.
Yes.
And Jacquemus, actually, it's a sort of case study in itself, because he did it basically through social media and through an iconic an iconic bag, you know, the very small little bag that
Yeah.
then became kind of viral. And
Yes.
so this is one example. And what he says that Anna Wintour told him, so when he was at the beginning,
Just dropping the name, yes.
yeah, what would you like? I mean, which brand would you like to work for? And he said, no, I want to work for myself. I want to have my own brand. And it's amazing. And the way I think he got exactly in the understanding that consumers now need visual stimulation and experiences. And this is what he does brilliantly, you know, for social media mainly. So this is one way. And this tells me that potentially, for instance, I'm looking at Africa right now because it's such an interesting country, because also culturally speaking, it has become very appealing to the Western world.
Yep.
And somehow I link the successfulness of these. You can be an independent brand if you have a very smart way of talking to people through your social media channels, through the way also you create. Sustainability, we said, is very important. Also, be very transparent. These can help, actually, this can facilitate your resonance with a certain market. I'm looking at Africa right now. With China, it's quite interesting because I think that country branding still matters quite a lot for us. And so the reputation of the countries around the world, especially in these days. And so I can see, I mean, there are Chinese luxury brands there, but my point is, if you want to have a global market, this brand should be appealing to the Western world as well, in a way. And I think that still the reputations of the countries play a part in that. So again, we go back to the idea that it's not just an economic or a strategic decision. It also relates to how we perceive things. But definitely, luxury is global. And, you know, historically, of course, all sorts of reasons, but historically, the luxury industry was born in the Western world. But I can see now, and I see now, that emerging countries or emerging brands from emerging markets can also have their own space in the industry. Yes.
Yeah, your what you were saying about Africa, your interest in Africa at the moment. One of the earlier podcasts was an interview with an African-born Ghanaian artist who now works in London, Kojo Marfo, and he. When they had his first solo show down in Mayfair at JD Mallet, it was interesting the way they did that, because they involved a luxury design group to create silk scarves and pocket handkerchiefs, silk pocket handkerchiefs. You know, silk we associate as a material with luxury, obviously, of a couple of his paintings, and they used Instagram to actually model. You know, they were getting models in to actually show how beautiful that. But these were the paintings, but they were being worn by people, which struck me as a very, very interesting move away. And it's happened before, obviously, but it tends in the past, in my experience, to have happened with old masters. Like Botticelli is a very good example of using the not the the Primavera sometimes, but usually the Venus rising from the waves. On Dolce & Gabbana used it, for example, famously. I think Paul Rocha used it. So, but it's very interesting suddenly seeing the launch of a contemporary artist no one had really heard of before onto the London scene. So suddenly his images were on matches near Oxford Circus as digital images in the shopping street. You know, I know it's not a luxury shopping street as such, really, but also people were wearing these silk garments.
Yeah, and this speaks actually on how our our markets have also changed. Where you have, you know, it's about the communication, really. It's about surprising people, the wow effect, as we call it, right? To do something that, yes, it has been done before, but it's a great way to launch, in a way, to think outside the box and to go beyond the dimension of the products. It can be, you know, a work of art, but it can also be a dress. Why don't we do something different?
Yes.
And this is a communication. It's about, I think there is a lot, said about storytelling. I think that the telling stories is what we need.
Yeah.
We go back maybe to Homeros and the Iliad, when we were saying, well, nice stories. People need to hear nice stories. And so people need or want to hear who's behind the brand I'm buying, what is behind the object I'm buying, because even a silk handkerchief, yeah, silk is luxury, okay, and you can talk about the manufacturer, that's fine. But what about, the design was made by such and such artist,
Yes.
the artist is coming, has this interesting background. Yes. It's a sort of, not only it's a topic of conversation with people, but it's also something that somehow you feel that you have acquired a piece of that story, of that person, of that individual life. And this is behind what's happening today, that we say, well, it's marketing, it's branding, whatever, but no, it's something deeper. If you do it correctly, if you do it with purpose, it's something deeper than that.
Yeah, and as you say, it's always been there in in the history of luxury goods and art, that in the literature we read, people, Vasari in his Lives of the Great Artists, it's what people, the reason people read those is for the wonderful anecdotes, the stories of the artists' lives. And you buy a little bit of that when you actually purchase one of their works. And I think that's also, as you say, that's very true of the luxury industry. With I'm sure that when you go in and get the owners, to talk about their brands, I bet they tell a lot of stories about the craftsmanship behind the making of the objects, the care that goes into the production of them, but also the stories behind using a certain design, and so on. Yeah, so you are buying into that, and then that means the consumer, of course, has a story to tell their friends. It's not just, oh, I've got a Gucci handbag. It's, this is the edition, this edition, and they only made 5 of them, and someone else who has one, and the story behind it becomes part of the consumption, and then the continuing marketing of that object through the consumer.
Exactly. That's why there are psychological studies saying that technically, as you said, everybody could buy a Gucci handbag
if they have money,
as long as they have money. Yeah. That's okay, right?
Whereas, of course, that's the difference in the art world. My students are often surprised when I say, if you want to buy a work by a new artist that Larry Gagosian is launching, just because you've got money doesn't mean you can buy it. He will choose the people who buy it because it's important to him and his brand that certain collectors, famous collectors, have it. And therefore, that's where people buy at auction, because no one can stop them buying at auction. It's the highest bidder gets the works. And we saw the Damien Hirst famous sale where he was selling his primary works at auction for the first time. And his argument was, I'm fed up with my dealer, with my agents selecting people. People should be allowed to buy my work if they have money to buy it. So that brings us kind of full circle to that world of business and money and exchange and why people buy luxury. So Federica, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the listeners as well to being a guest today and giving up your time today. And maybe in a year or two's time, down the river, as it were, you could be a guest again and talk about how luxury has developed over that next 2-year period. But I think I know your way of teaching, and I know that you said it at the start of the podcast that it's not just about historical knowledge, it's about knowing seeing over the horizon, trying to get your students to look beyond the horizon and seeing what's coming up in the future. So we look forward to maybe another podcast in the future where we hear all about that. So thank you very much, Federica.
Thank you, David, for having me. Thank you very much.